The frantic fear I'd been feeling since finding my girlfriend missing turned to a low simmer of panic as I approached the open front door of the secluded house. A soft breeze whispered through the tall trees surrounding the structure. Despite my relatively warm clothes, jeans and a hoodie, I felt cold. As cold as I'd ever felt in my life. I stepped into the house, Marcus's house, with mounting trepidation. The night's events had taken me completely by surprise, and I didn't think I could handle any more shock. The living room to my right had been trashed, the record player stolen. The only smell in the place was one that struck me as hate. I'd never smelled hate before. I didn't even know such an emotion could have a smell. But now, I was sure the hanging scent was just that. There was a light on in the living room from a knocked-over lamp, but the hallway to the kitchen was dark. I looked up the stairs, only to see darkness beyond the banister. There was a dim light on in the kitchen at the end of the hallway, but I couldn't see its source. I could only see a small slice of the kitchen from where I stood. I expected to hear Banjo talking on the phone with the police, but the house was shockingly silent. I quickly dismissed the notion of calling out for Banjo, feeling that shattering the silence would bring nothing good. Somewhere up ahead, a floorboard creaked softly. Easing myself forward with thoughts of Aaron in trouble, I moved down the dark hallway toward the kitchen. I stopped just outside the kitchen and leaned forward, looking toward where I remembered the phone being. Banjo lay with his upper body on the countertop, a cleaver embedded in the back of his head. The phone receiver sat on the floor next to where Banjo's blood was still collecting, dripping off the counter and onto the floor. A floorboard creaked behind me. I looked over my shoulder to see a man standing in the hallway between me and the still open front door. But he didn't have a man's head. Instead, he had a grotesque, hairy head with 8 bulbous, black eyes arranged in pairs amid the tufts of black hair. The mouth gaped as if locked in a scream, with 2 large black fangs extending out. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, that seemed like an eternity. I thought I was seeing a true monster, a man with the head of a spider. The possibility that it was a mask seemed the least likely option in my frenzied and terror-stricken mind. In my breathless paralysis, some automatic part of my brain noted the combat knife he held in one gloved hand, along with paint-splattered overalls and a dark hooded sweatshirt. That same automatic part of my mind, a part of the lizard brain surely, zapped me into action as the man stepped toward me. I ran into the kitchen, taking a right into the dining room and headed for the back door. The man's heavy footfalls sounded behind me like roars of thunder. I grabbed the doorknob, turned it, and tried to yank the door open. It was locked. The thunder approached, getting closer, promising the pain of lightning. I fumbled with the deadbolt, finally unlocking the door and yanking it open. I pulled the door to close it behind me, but it was pulled out of my hand as the man caught it and wrenched it open again. Bolting off the porch, I did what I did best when confronted with a dangerous situation. I ran. I ran past the shack and down a gently sloping hill along a trail toward one of Marcus's gardens. The man followed, huffing behind me, his presence driving me forward as fast as my legs could take me. With no idea where I was going or what I would do when I got there, I simply ran in as fast a line as I could, thinking that turning could waste precious time and allow the man to catch me. The garden area appeared up ahead in a flat clearing, surrounded by tall redwood and Douglas fir trees. I blew past it, no longer on the trail as I ran into the woods. I had never been past the garden before, so what little edge I'd held by knowing the area was immediately gone. I could trip on a branch, or a rock, or a fallen tree, and then it would be all over. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep running. It was the only option in my mind. My legs burned and my muscles ached, but I ran. The ground sloped downward, at first gradually, and then steeply, propelling me through the trees and bushes, my momentum growing with each step. Then I was suddenly running toward a drop-off that came out of the darkness with all the suddenness of a lightning strike. It was a cliff, and I was moving way too fast to stop.
Yo, Dustin, wake up!
Someone shook me awake. I opened my eyes, squinting to see who was standing over me in the dark.
What?
I said, voice thick with sleep.
I need your help,
The man said.
remember? The deal?
The fog of sleep parted, and I realized it was Marcus Nesbitt, my current boss, standing over me. But I couldn't remember any deal.
What deal?
I said, whispering. I tried to sit up, but my girlfriend, Erin, was lying on my right arm. She groaned in her sleep as I extracted my arm. The shack that we were sleeping in was cold. It didn't have a heater. In the faint illumination shining in the shack window from the porch light, I could see that the other girl we shared the shack with, Dawn, was curled on her bed, which was really just a mattress on the floor in the corner. The bed Erin and I slept on was a full mattress in the opposite corner. I rubbed my eyes as Marcus squatted next to me, waiting patiently. Slowly, it came back. Toward the end of my 14-hour trim shift, after I'd been smoking weed pretty much all day, Marcus asked me if I would come with him to a deal for an extra $100. I had agreed readily enough, but I didn't realize at the time it would be taking place in the middle of the night. Or maybe he did say something about that while Dawn, Erin, and I were trimming. It was all a fog. Still, $100 was $100. The whole reason Erin and I had come up to Humboldt County this fall was to make money. Well, that, and to smoke some of the best weed in the world.
Okay,
I said, gathering myself.
I'll get dressed. Meet me at the truck,
He said.
Yeah, okay.
Marcus, an easygoing hippie dude with long hair he usually kept in twin braids like Willie Nelson, stood and walked out of the frigid shack, shutting the door softly behind him. I turned around and leaned over Erin, who was asleep on her stomach. I kissed her on the neck, which was a surefire way to wake her up. She stirred and turned over, gracing me with a small smile on her beautiful face. After blinking, she looked up at me, emerald eyes striking even in the dark.
What's up? I gotta go help Marcus,
I said,
I'll be back before too long.
as she stretched her arms and arched her back. A blonde dreadlock fell over her face.
Okay,
She said sleepily.
be careful.
I moved the dreadlock aside and kissed her. When I went to pull away, she grabbed the back of my head and held the kiss for a few wonderful moments longer. She giggled as she released me. Man, there was something about her giggles. They made my heart swell every time.
Love you.
I said, getting out of bed and pulling on my jeans.
I love you too.
She said.
Now, let me sleep.
She giggled again, turning over. When I was dressed and ready to go, I stepped out the door and took one last look at the woman I loved. Then I shut the door and walked among the towering redwood trees up toward Marcus's brown two-story house. I passed the house, sticking my hands in the kangaroo pocket of my hoodie to protect against the cold. Marcus's truck, a red and white Ford F-150 with a dented fender, sat running in the dirt driveway. Another truck was parked behind it, also running. I didn't recognize it. Then again, Erin and I had only been working for Marcus for a little over a week. We'd managed to get on with him after a scary few days with another grower on the mountain. I got into the truck and rubbed my hands together, putting them next to an air vent to get them warm.
Ready?
Marcus asked.
Yeah.
I said.
Who's that behind us?
Marcus put the truck in gear.
That's another grower, Banjo. He and I back each other up whenever we're dealing with a new buyer.
So what do you need me for?
Banjo is going to hang back with the product while you and I go meet these guys. Once we see the money, I'll signal Banjo to come with the product.
As he spoke, Marcus turned around in the driveway, Banjo's truck following behind.
How much is it? You ask a lot of questions, my dude,
Marcus said, but with a light tone. I shrugged.
I figure if I'm risking getting busted by the cops, I should know how much we're dealing with.
Marcus passed through the open gate to his property and pulled out onto the dirt road.
15 pounds.
he said. I whistled.
Nice. How much of that did I trim? You, Aaron, and Don did it all,
Marcus said with a smile.
Some of the best trimmigrants I've ever had.
I smiled at the local name for trimmers they had. Trimmigrants were exactly what they sounded like. People who came to Northern California in the fall during harvest season to trim the marijuana buds, making them look attractive for the buyers all the way down the line. As we headed down the dirt road, I thought about what Aaron and I would do with the money we would be leaving with at the end of the harvest. Our plan was to get a van so we could travel the states without having to hitchhike or bus anymore. Aaron was always making bracelets and necklaces out of beads and stuff, and I had been learning how to tattoo, so we thought we could get enough money for gas and food to travel around for a while. We could hit up music festivals and offer our services. We'd even heard that there was to be another Woodstock next year. Woodstock 99 was set to be a fun time, and Aaron and I were determined to go. Thoughts of the future bounced around my head as I looked out the window at the dark trees lining the road. I didn't know exactly where we were, only that we were on what some people called Murder Mountain. Apparently, a good number of people had gone missing or been killed on the mountain over the years. When Aaron and I had been in town looking for work, we did see an awful lot of missing person signs taped and stapled around. Plus, we'd already encountered some shady people. The first grower Aaron and I had worked for seemed like the type to rip you off, and he'd certainly tried to sexually assault Aaron, which was why we left. But I doubted he would kill anyone. Still, I could see how it would be easy to dispose of a body in these dense woods. There seemed to be endless forest up here, with properties like Marcus's few and far between.
You know how to fire a gun?
Marcus asked, out of the blue.
What?
I said, turning to look at him.
A gun? You serious?
Marcus smiled, but it seemed forced.
Nah, not really. I'm sure it'll be fine. But just in case something goes down, there's a pistol in the glove compartment. Just thought you should know.
He paused.
And I have one on me.
A heavy, queasy feeling of fear invaded me as I realized this could be truly dangerous. Getting arrested was one thing, but getting shot at or killed was a whole different story. We turned off the relatively smooth dirt road and onto a lesser-used track. The truck bounced over the uneven ground as we made our way along, the trees closing in on either side as the road narrowed. An open spot in the wall of trees came up on our right.
That's where Banjo's going to pull in to wait. With the lights off, no one will be able to see him.
I didn't doubt the veracity of Marcus's words. There was a narrow track that curved through the trees and out of sight into the darkness beyond. After we passed it, I looked back and saw Banjo's truck pull onto that narrow track. Any sign of his truck was soon gone from view. Marcus drove on while I thought about the gun in the glove compartment. I hated guns. I hated violence. I considered myself a pacifist. There were better ways to go about the world that didn't involve hurting other people. Even back at the other grow-op, when I found out that guy, Tate, had grabbed Aaron while the two of them were out in the garden, I hadn't done anything. Not that I hadn't wanted to, but I was smart enough to know that it wouldn't end well for me or Aaron. That was what I told myself anyway. The truth was, and this was something it took a long time for me to admit to myself, I was scared. I've never liked confrontation. I've never liked the sick and shaky feeling I got when faced with a potential fight. Plus, Tate was so much bigger than me. I'm not a big guy by anyone's definition. I weigh 160 on a good day, and I'm not even 6 foot. Tate had a good 5 or 6 inches on me, plus a good 50 pounds at least. Then there were all his buddies who walked around with guns. It would have been me against all of them. No, it wouldn't have ended well. But even if it had just been me and Tate, I probably wouldn't have done anything. I would have been too shit scared to do anything but run away with Aaron. When we were out of there, after Marcus had given us a chance to trim for him, I had asked Aaron about it. I had asked her if she would have preferred me to have confronted Tate. She'd said, "No, of course not." But I saw the disappointment in her eyes. It was impossible to miss. Some part of her wanted me to stand up for her in the most ancient and basic way, with violence. I didn't blame her for wanting that, because I wanted it too. I just didn't have it in me.
Here we go,
Marcus said as we pulled into a dirt clearing. The track continued beyond the clearing, and a blue SUV was sitting there on the other side, pointed away from us. I figured they would go their way, and we would go back the way we'd come when all was said and done. I glanced down at the glove compartment as 2 doors opened on the SUV, and 2 guys stepped out. Their hands were empty, but they wore bulky jackets that could easily conceal pistols. Marcus killed the engine but left the headlights on to illuminate the space between the 2 vehicles. He turned to look at me.
Relax,
He said.
it'll be fine. Just stand near the truck. You don't have to do anything else.
I nodded and got out of the truck, tossing one last glance at the glove compartment.
How's it going?
Marcus asked, walking toward the 2 men. They both had the stereotypical look of SoCal skater dudes. They had flat-brimmed baseball caps, baggy jeans worn low on their hips, and skate shoes. They looked to be in their mid-20s.
I'm Marcus. Which of you is Lance?
One of them stepped forward and shook Marcus's hand.
That's me. Good to finally meet you. Yeah, you too.
Marcus said.
One of my buyers got locked up, so I'm hoping this could be a good thing for both of us. For sure,
The other guy said. There was a moment of awkward silence. Lance rubbed his hands together. 4 plumes of vapor escaped our mouths as we breathed.
Well, let's do this thing, I guess.
Marcus said.
Do me a favor, would you? Open up the tailgate? Why?
Lance said, getting defensive.
As a gesture of courtesy. Before I call the product in, I'd like to see that there's no one else in the vehicle. I'd also like to see the money. The money is nearby,
Lance said.
Let's see the product.
Marcus took a step back, his arms coming slightly out from his sides.
I told you how this was going to go down over the phone,
He said.
You agreed to the setup. Now you're trying to change things. I don't like that. We're taking all the risk here,
Lance said.
What's to say you don't just rip us off? Your boy vouched for me, remember?
Marcus said.
And he vouched for me too. Right, exactly.
Marcus said.
And you agreed to do this my way. So let's just stick to that plan, or I'll just turn around and leave. I can find another buyer.
Lance's boyish face remained hard as he stared at Marcus. His eyes darted over to me, seeming to size me up. Then he gestured at the other guy and said,
Joey, open the back so we can see. Bring the money.
I expected Joey to grab a bag or a briefcase from the SUV, but he didn't. He simply opened the back door, revealing the cargo area. There was assorted junk back there, but no one hiding out. Then he walked forward, reaching into one jacket pocket and coming out with a wad of cash. He stopped next to Lance and handed the money to him. Lance held it up so Marcus could see, fanning it out. I could see that it was a mix of 50s and 100s.
Thank you,
Marcus said.
I'll radio my guy now.
He reached into a pocket and brought out a radio, which he used to call Banjo. While we waited for the product to show up, Marcus came back to the truck and grabbed a money counting machine from the back seat, setting it on the hood. A branch snapped off in the woods to our left. Everyone turned that way, peering into the impenetrable darkness.
Just an animal,
Marcus said.
No need to get jumpy.
The sound of Banjo's truck engine grew steadily. Soon, his headlights shined through the woods. He pulled up behind Marcus's truck, leaving his own vehicle running as he got out and grabbed the 2 large duffel bags filled with 15 pounds of weed from the truck bed. Banjo, a wiry, tough-looking man in his 50s or 60s, dropped the bags between the 2 parties, then stepped back on the other side of Marcus's truck to watch. Another branch snapped in the woods, this time closer and louder.
What the fuck was that?
Lance said, reaching toward his back waistband.
You trying to rip us off? You got people out there?
Marcus looked toward the woods, worry creeping into his face. Another branch snapped, this time from the other side of the clearing. A savage scream tore through the woods, sounding like some kind of banshee. Then, gunfire started. The crack of a rifle exploded from my left, I ducked next to the truck, distantly aware of Marcus grunting in pain. While the sound from the first shot was still bouncing off the trees, a second shot erupted, this time from my right. It was followed quickly by a third and a fourth. I stared out into the woods, seemingly unable to move from my spot. The muscles in my legs and arms thrummed like plucked guitar strings as I vibrated with implacable fear. Moving my head automatically, I turned to look at the space between the vehicles, still splashed in light from Marcus's truck. From my angle, crouching next to the passenger side of the truck, I could still see Lance and Joey. Lance lay face first on the ground, the left side of his head blown off. Damaged brain matter crawled out of his skull onto the Humboldt County dirt. Joey moved with exaggerated and desperate jerking motions, pulling himself along the ground toward the SUV. He left a trail of foamy pink blood behind him as he crawled and coughed, each cough sounding wetter than the last. I couldn't see Marcus from where I was. The guns were still firing, punching into glass and metal behind me. I realized that Banjo had retreated back to his own truck and was firing back with what sounded to my unpracticed ear like a pistol. What had been near constant fire suddenly slowed to a pop here and there. Movement sounded from the woods, the ambushers moving to get a better vantage point or to come in for the kill.
Kid,
Banjo shouted.
you still alive?
I couldn't answer. I felt that any sort of voluntary movement, which included using my voice, would cause a chain reaction that would let my suddenly full bladder loose. Not pissing my pants suddenly became the most important thing in my world. More important than living. More important than getting back to Aaron. More important than even taking my next breath.
Kid!
Banjo shouted. I heard the mechanical knocking of a transmission shifting. Banjo was leaving. A gunshot sounded, and something passed through the air directly in front of me, sending my previously malfunctioning instinct for survival into overdrive when I realized it was a bullet that had just missed my head by a few inches. My paralysis shattered. I darted away from the truck, running back toward Banjo's vehicle as it backed down the dirt track.
Come on!
The older man yelled.
In the back!
Gunshots resumed from the woods. I felt something like a paintball strike the inside of my right calf as I ran. Banjo slowed just enough for me to jump into the truck bed. He fired his pistol out the window and into the woods as he drove backward, jerking the wheel left and right to keep from running off the road. More bullets hit the truck, and Banjo cursed from the driver's seat. Then we were around the bend, and the gunfire stopped. The only sound was the crunching of dirt under the tires and the rev of the engine and the frantic whispering of my breath. Still shaking, I lay in the back of the truck, looking up toward the tops of the redwood trees. I reached down and felt the crotch of my jeans, surprised to find the material dry. My chin quivered as an overwhelming relief swirled and tangled oddly with the fear that was still running its course. I felt sick. My hands and feet were icy, and my armpits were damp with cold sweat. Tears escaped my eyes and traveled down my temples. I wiped them away, ridiculously afraid of what Banjo would think if he saw me crying.
You hit?
He called.
No.
I said automatically, but then I remembered the sensation like getting hit by a paintball. I sat up as we came to the track where Banjo had waited earlier. He quickly maneuvered the back of the truck into it so he could turn around. As we sped back toward the dirt road on which Marcus lived, I lifted my right pant leg and found that I had been hit. A divot, about a half-inch deep and 4 inches long, ran along my inner calf. Seeing the blood made me feel like vomiting, but I swallowed the urge down, barely.
Nearest phone is at Marcus's.
Banjo called.
We'll go there.
Erin's father had bought her a cell phone for her birthday, but the thing didn't work up here in the mountains. I knew that Marcus had a cell phone too. He was one of the few other people I knew who did, since they weren't very affordable. But he said he could only ever get a signal in town, and even then, it was hit or miss. So the only way to call the police was with a landline. Banjo barely slowed as we came to the proper dirt road, bouncing off the track and onto one of the Murder Mountain back roads. I sat up in the truck and gazed backward at the dust rising from the truck's passing. The trees and the dust and the road were painted faintly red by the taillights. I took it as a good sign that I could see no vehicle pursuing us. Logic leaked through the fog of fear still inundating my mind, and I thought, Why would they follow? They have the money and the dope. We didn't see their faces. They got exactly what they wanted. Following that line of thinking, I wondered about how they had known where the meeting would be. They had clearly been out in the woods before Marcus and I had arrived, so they hadn't followed us. If they had been in cahoots with Lance and Joey, the two buyers had been double-crossed and paid for their poor choice and criminal conspirators with their lives. I supposed it didn't really matter. It would be in the police's hands momentarily. But that brought a whole host of other questions to mind. Like, would I be arrested for participating in an illegal drug deal? Would I need to testify? What would happen to Erin if I went to jail? Would she wait for me? I gripped my head, trying to quell the sudden influx of questions that only added to my discomfort, making me feel more ill than I had been after looking at my wound, which was now starting to hurt with a very insistent throb. Banjo pulled into Marcus's driveway, still driving like we were being pursued. I thought we were going to crash into the house, but he slammed the brakes. The truck skidded several feet until it came to a stop near the front porch. Banjo shut the truck off and jumped out, hustling toward the front door. I jumped out of the truck bed and followed along, now limping thanks to the pain in my calf. I almost slammed into Banjo's back as he came up short a few feet from the front door. He tensed up and suddenly pulled his pistol out of his waistband.
What is it?
I asked.
Shh,
he said. Then he checked his weapon and said,
Shit, should have brought an extra mag.
I looked around him and saw that the front door was open several inches. The wood around the lock was cracked and splintered. Someone had broken in. One thought came rushing to mind, crowding out all others. I turned and ran off the porch, heading around the house.
Where are you going?
Banjo hissed. I didn't answer. I just ran around the house and down the short trail to the shack. My stomach clenched when I saw that the door to the shack was wide open. Bursting into the building, I saw nothing but 2 empty mattresses with disheveled sleeping bags and my backpack. No sign of Erin, no sign of Dawn. I knew what had happened. I knew it as well as I knew that I was no good in a fight. But my mind rebelled against the truth as I latched onto the fact that Erin's backpack was gone, along with most of her stuff. The same was true of Dawn's items. Maybe they ran, I thought. Maybe they're hiding in the woods. The notion was ridiculous. No one took the time to pack up all their belongings if they felt they were in immediate danger. They'd been taken by whoever had broken into Marcus's house. I was willing to bet it was the same group who'd ambushed us at the deal. Not only had they come away with 15 pounds of weed and a ton of cash, but they'd also taken whatever money Marcus had stashed in the house, along with 2 attractive young women. They'd probably even taken all the plants that hadn't yet been harvested, or at least as many as they could carry. Thinking only of getting to Banjo, I needed help, and Banjo seemed capable. He would know what to do. I ran out of the shack and back up to the house, still limping on my right leg. Not knowing if the back door was unlocked and unwilling to waste any time finding out, I went around to the front, only slowing when I stepped through the door into the house. I'd been in the house before and knew the layout of the first floor. Marcus had invited Erin and me inside for dinner the first night. I also knew that the house had a certain feel to it. That first night, Marcus had music playing from a record player in the living room, the smells of cooking wafting from the kitchen, and warm lights on in all the downstairs rooms. All these things had given the place a homey feel that was completely gone now. The living room to my right had been trashed, the record player stolen. The only smell in the place was one that struck me as hate. I'd never smelled hate before. Didn't even know such an emotion could have a smell. But now I was sure the hanging scent was just that. There was a light on in the living room from a knocked-over lamp, but the hallway to the kitchen was dark. I looked up the stairs only to see darkness beyond the banister. There was a dim light on in the kitchen at the end of the hallway, but I couldn't see its source. I could only see a small slice of the kitchen from where I stood. I expected to hear Banjo talking on the phone, but the house was shockingly silent. I quickly dismissed the notion of calling out for Banjo, feeling that shattering the silence would bring nothing good. Somewhere up ahead, a floorboard creaked softly. Easing myself forward with thoughts of Erin in trouble, I moved down the dark hallway toward the kitchen. I stopped just outside the kitchen and leaned forward, looking toward where I remembered the phone being. Banjo lay with his upper body on the countertop, a cleaver embedded in the back of his head. The phone receiver sat on the floor next to where Banjo's blood was still collecting, dripping off the counter and onto the floor. A floorboard creaked behind me. I looked over my shoulder to see a man standing in the hallway between me and the still open front door. But he didn't have a man's head. Instead, he had a grotesque, hairy head with 8 bulbous black eyes arranged in pairs amid the tufts of black hair. The mouth gaped as if locked in a scream, with 2 large black fangs extending out. I couldn't breathe. For a moment that seemed like an eternity, I thought I was seeing a true monster, a man with the head of a spider. The possibility that it was a mask seemed the least likely option in my frenzied and terror-stricken mind. In my breathless paralysis, some automatic part of my brain noted the combat knife he held in one gloved hand, along with paint-splattered overalls and a dark hooded sweatshirt. That same automatic part of my mind, a part of the lizard brain surely, zapped me into action as the man stepped toward me. I ran into the kitchen, taking a right into the dining room and headed for the back door. The man's heavy footfalls sounded behind me like roars of thunder. I grabbed the doorknob, turned it, and tried to yank the door open. It was locked. The thunder approached, getting closer, promising the pain of lightning. I fumbled with the deadbolt, finally unlocking the door and yanking it open. I pulled the door to close it behind me, but it was pulled out of my hand as the man caught it and wrenched it open again. Bolting off the porch, I did what I did best when confronted with a dangerous situation. I ran. I ran past the shack and down a gently sloping hill along a trail toward one of Marcus's gardens. The man followed, huffing behind me, his presence driving me forward as fast as my legs could take me. I was no longer limping and no longer feeling the pain in my right calf. With no idea where I was going or what I would do when I got there, I simply ran in as straight a line as I could, knowing that turning could waste precious time and allow the man to catch me. The garden area appeared up ahead in a flat clearing surrounded by tall redwood and Douglas fir trees. I blew past it, no longer on the trail as I ran into the woods. I had never been past the garden before, so what little edge I'd held by knowing the area was immediately gone. I could trip on a branch, or a rock, or a fallen tree, and then it would all be over. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep running. It was the only option in my mind. My lungs burned and my muscles ached, but I ran. The ground sloped downward, at first gradually and then steeply, propelling me through the trees and bushes, my momentum growing with each step. Then I was suddenly running toward a drop-off that came out of the darkness with all the suddenness of a lightning strike. It was a cliff, and I was moving way too fast to stop. My stomach lurched into my chest as I realized in a split second that there were trees growing at the bottom of the cliff. Their branches reached out toward me, some 10 yards away from the edge of the cliff. Instead of trying to slow down, that ancient survival instinct deep in my lizard brain took over, and I kept my momentum up, jumping off the edge of the cliff at the last moment and half sailing, half falling through the air toward a tall and mature fir tree. I smashed into the branches, the spiky pine needles poking at me as I clutched out with both hands, knowing I had to grab a branch or suffer serious injuries as I fell from the tree. A branch snapped as I fell, flipping me back. I hit another branch, which bent under my weight, slowing my descent. Gripping anything I could, I tried frantically to stop my fall. My hands slipped from the branches here and there until I latched onto one and managed to hold it. My shoulder joint screamed as my body weight pulled down, but I stopped. I was still trying to come to terms with what I'd just done when I heard a muffled curse from the cliff top, followed abruptly by a crunching thud down below. It took me a minute to untangle my limbs from the branches of the tree, getting myself into a secure position from which I could peer down at the boulders at the base of the cliff. I could just make out the outline of a body down there, in a pile next to the craggy boulders. It wasn't a massive drop-off, maybe 30 feet or so. Sitting where I was in the tree, feeling all the cuts and scratches and soon-to-be bruises the tree had inflicted upon me, I waited several minutes before moving down. The human-shaped lump among the boulders hadn't moved. When I reached the ground, having dropped the last 8 feet from the lowest branches, I could clearly see the man who'd killed Banjo and who'd meant to kill me. His spiderhead mask was still on his head, although it seemed to be twisted to the side. Either that, or his head was twisted to the side. I couldn't tell which. It appeared as though he'd hit the boulder after falling off the cliff. Then he came to rest on the ground on his back. His right hand was at an odd angle to his forearm, and I couldn't see the knife anywhere. Only after grabbing a softball-sized rock and a 3-foot stick from the ground did I venture toward him. From a safe distance, I poked him with the stick. He didn't move. I moved the stick and poked his broken arm. He still didn't move. The paint-splattered overalls were too familiar, although I couldn't place them. I'd smoked more weed in the couple of weeks I'd been in Humboldt County than I had in my entire life leading up to that point. So it wasn't really a surprise that my memory wasn't even as sharp as the stick I held in my hand. Gaining more confidence, I set the stick down and moved closer, kneeling next to the man. Still holding the rock up, I reached out with my free left hand and grabbed the rubbery, hairy mask, pulling it off his head. I immediately recognized his face. He had shaggy jet black hair and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. His small eyes, large nostrils, and slit of a mouth gave him a naturally cruel look. I'd seen him at Tate's farm, standing on the back patio of Tate's house when Aaron and I had arrived. That was the only time I'd seen him, and he'd been wearing the overalls then. His eyes suddenly shot open, along with his mouth, which released a piercing, pain-filled scream as he reached for me with his unbroken arm. I slammed the rock down into his face with a crunch. He paused briefly with the impact, then resumed his scream. So I hit him again, feeling the structure of his skull change with the blow. He stopped screaming in a spasmodic way that made me think his lungs had stopped working. His eyes stayed open, looking up at me, but his hand fell limply away. I stood, still clutching the rock, and stared down at him.
"Oh, my God,"
I said.
"Oh my fucking God, what did I do?"
Dropping the rock, I stumbled away and bent over, clutching my knees as I drooled and breathed heavily and tried to keep from puking. Feeling like I was high on some kind of awful upper, I stood and began to pace, glancing at the dead body. The body I made dead. After a minute of panicked pacing, I bent over again and looked at the ground. There was too much going through my head, too many crazy thoughts and fears, and something caught my eye. I shifted my head and saw the combat knife lying nearby. One singular word suddenly came to the forefront of my mind, so big and loud and imposing that it commanded all my other thoughts to scurry fearfully to their respective holes. It was the one word that told me exactly what needed to happen. Aaron. I gripped the knife in one hand while I picked up the phone from the puddle of Banjo's blood. Putting the cold plastic to my ear, I heard nothing but silence. With the index finger of my knife hand, I pressed the phone's switch hook, then released it again. Still nothing. No sound at all. With a sense of helpless doom, I realized the line had been cut. Even if it hadn't, I wasn't sure how much immediate help the police would be. I'd heard stories about Murder Mountain being an outlaw place where the police didn't often venture for fear of being shot at. Shortly after Marcus had hired us as trimmers, I told him about what happened to Aaron at Tate's place and asked him if he thought I should call the police. Marcus just scoffed.
"You can call, but they won't do shit. They don't come up here. Besides, I don't want the cops anywhere near my house. I could go to prison for a long time if they found my gardens."
I tried not to look down at Banjo's body as I hung the phone up in the cradle. There was no help coming. I was the only one who could do anything to help Aaron. The notion made my legs feel weak. I suddenly had to pee again. Walking numbly, I made my way to the bathroom and emptied my bladder. The relief helped to clear my head slightly, just enough for another thought to slip into place. I picked up the combat knife from the bathroom counter and then went searching for what I knew had to be somewhere in the house. Rifles. One of the hardest things I ever had to do up until that point was strip the dead man's clothes off. Every part of me just wanted to give up and leave him there while I ran off into the woods in any direction, getting away from him, from this situation, from Murder Mountain and Humboldt County in Northern California and everything. But of course, that wasn't an option. because what I wanted more than anything else was to see Erin again, to make sure she was okay, to save her. Wasn't that what partners were supposed to do for each other? To save the other when they were in trouble? I thought so. I certainly couldn't just leave her to whatever terrible fate awaited her without my intervention. So despite my utter revulsion and my quavering muscles and spastic stomach, I undressed the dead man whose name I didn't know, and I pulled his clothes on. He was a larger man than me, so the overalls fit over my jeans with relative ease. I had to take my hoodie off to put his on, and it was fairly baggy on me. I wore the clothes like he had, with the overalls over the hoodie instead of under. I knew that the disguise wouldn't fool anyone for long if they were to inspect me closely, but it was better than nothing. With the spiderhead mask on, it could buy me precious time if someone spotted me on Tate's property. I knew where his property was because Marcus had stopped for Erin and I as we were walking down the mountain from there. That was how we had met. Erin and I stuck our thumbs out, thinking of just hitching a ride into Alder Point, the nearest town. Marcus stopped. One thing led to another, and he asked us if we wanted a job trimming. I immediately liked him more than Tate. Some people just have good vibes. That was Marcus. Now he was dead, and Tate was involved. Maybe he'd even masterminded the whole thing. Maybe I was wrong about him when I thought that he wasn't the killing type. One thing was for sure, he was the raping type. With that thought powering my movements, I hustled back up to Marcus's house. I grabbed the hunting rifle I'd found in his bedroom, and I dug the truck keys out of Banjo's pocket. Tate's property was several miles away, up the mountain. I got into Banjo's bullet-riddled truck, thankful when the engine came to life. Then I headed up the mountain. I came upon Tate's property from the side, moving through the woods, carrying the rifle in one hand and the combat knife in the other. I had the rubber spiderhead mask stuffed in a hip pocket of the overalls. I'd parked Banjo's truck in a pullout about a mile away, so it couldn't be seen from the road. After that, I had walked through the woods toward the property, hopping a fence and then making my way slowly and carefully until I had his house in view. The house was surrounded by several low buildings, all of them shacks of various sizes. One of them was where Erin and I had been sleeping during the short time we worked there. Another one was an equipment shed, where Tate kept most of his gardening tools. The third and final one was about the size of a 2-car garage and served to house the 4-wheelers Tate used to get to and from his gardens, which were placed strategically around his large property. The house, a 2-story cabin-style home with an unfinished enclosed front porch, sat facing a long driveway cluttered with trucks, many of them in disrepair or being used for parts. As I watched, lying on my belly under the branches of a small pine tree, a man I knew as Glenn stepped out of the house and onto the unfinished front porch. He turned around, seeming agitated, as Tate and another man I'd never seen before stepped onto the porch. They seemed to be in the middle of an argument, and their voices carried through the night.
I'm telling you, he's having fun with them,
Glenn said.
I don't want to see that shit. It makes me sick. I don't mind putting a bullet in someone, but what he does is fucked up. I don't give a shit whether you puke your goddamn guts out,
Tate said.
He should have been back by now. Go down there and make sure he's okay. If he wants to stay there all night playing with their guts or torturing them or whatever, that's on him. But you two need to make sure he's okay. Got it?
Glenn and the other guy reluctantly catapulted and got into one of the trucks parked in the driveway. Tate moved back inside the house while the two men left, going back down to Banjo's house. It would take them a while to find their friend, but once they saw that Banjo's truck was gone, they would probably know something was up. Which meant I had to make this quick. My plan was to sneak around until I found Erin and then get her out, hopefully without alerting anyone to my presence, and then get gone. We could go through the woods, get back to Banjo's truck, and get the hell out of Humboldt, and maybe contact the FBI or something, since local law enforcement was apparently no help. After the sound of the truck faded, I watched the property for a few minutes. When there was no further movement, I crawled out from under the tree and backed up until I was behind a large redwood tree. I propped the rifle against the tree. I didn't know what kind it was, only that it was a hunting rifle and had a scope. There wasn't a great place to put the knife, so I just stuck it down inside the overalls, putting it through my belt. After donning the spiderhead mask, I took a moment to get it situated, turning my head left and right while looking out of the eye holes. The visibility wasn't great, and it was loose, causing it to shift with every turn of my head. I took the mask off, pulled the hood on the sweatshirt up, and then pulled the mask down over the hood. This was much better, and it kept the mask in place and the eye holes lined up over my eyes. As I started toward the house with the rifle in hand, my legs suddenly got weak and started shaking. I ducked back behind the tree, collapsing to my knees and choking back a frightened sob. My throat felt narrow, my hands and feet freezing once again, my stomach spasming. I couldn't breathe, the rubber mask seeming to suffocate me. I yanked it off and spit stringy bile onto the ground. The chaotic jumble of my thoughts made it impossible to think clearly. With some effort, I managed to push one single thought to the forefront. Aaron. 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 Fighting against the powerful flow of fearful thoughts, I pictured Aaron and I traveling across the country in a van, laughing and singing as the sun set in front of us, the road stretching out to the horizon, promising a world of positive possibilities. Aaron. I breathed her name. Aaron. And again, calmly. Aaron. Aaron and Dustin. I smiled. My thoughts clearing, I looked down at the mask I'd tossed on the ground. I reached for it, only stopping when I realized something. I hadn't checked to see if the rifle was loaded. Pulling back the bolt, I saw that it was loaded. I had no idea how many bullets were in the weapon, and I didn't see any obvious magazine or clip or whatever they called them. I wasn't planning on using it anyway. If I had to use the rifle, I would probably be in trouble. Still, it was nice to know that I had at least one bullet if things went sideways. Keeping my future with Aaron firmly in mind, I pulled the mask back on and stood up. I moved slowly toward the house, staying behind trees or bushes whenever I could. The first structure I came to was the garage for the four-wheelers. Curious, I ducked in through the pedestrian door and looked inside at the three vehicles. All of them had keys in the ignitions. As I was stepping back toward the pedestrian door, which I had closed behind me, I heard footsteps crunching on the ground outside. There was a metal shelf with tools and oil containers on it about 10 feet to the right of the door. I hustled over, getting on the other side of it just as the pedestrian door opened. The garage door started to go up, the motor groaning as it worked. I didn't know if it was Tate or someone else in the garage with me. They hadn't come into my field of view. My back pressed against the wall, I held the rifle to my chest, hoping that they wouldn't see me. Suddenly, I realized what would happen if I had to fire the rifle. It would alert everyone to my presence. Surely whoever else was left in the place would come running at the sound of the shot. With shaking limbs, I shifted the rifle into my left hand, pulling my right hand up to shove it down the baggy overalls to grab the knife. There was a thump like a heavy bag being dropped. I propped the rifle next to the shelf and held the knife down behind my right thigh. Then the person in the garage with me came into view, looking down at one of the four-wheelers. It was a man I had met before, with short red hair and a stout, thick frame. His name was Conley, and Tate called him his grow manager. He saw me in the corner and flinched.
Jesus Christ, Roach,
he said.
You scared the shit out of me. The hell you doing out here? You know Tate just sent Glenn and Irvin down to find you?
Even as he spoke, I could see the change in his eyes. I was too short to be Roach and too skinny. That kill or be killed part of my brain told me to lunge at him with the combat knife. It screamed at me to move, to take the split-second advantage I had before Conley screamed, or ran, or went for a gun hidden on his person. But I couldn't move. Now was the time to do something. Now or never. But I was paralyzed once again. The jumbled mess of disparate thoughts invaded my mind, replacing the clean and simple notion of Aaron, which encompassed all that was good and right with the world. I lost it. It was gone. Conley cocked his head slightly to the side, like a dog trying to solve a puzzle to get a treat.
Who is that?
he said, still half smiling, still thinking it was someone playing a prank on him.
Dawson, hey you! How'd you get out of here so fast?
He stepped forward, his smile fading away.
Quit fucking around!
He was getting angry, reaching out for the mask to rip it off my head. Time seemed to slow as something like clarity came back into my mind. He wasn't even scared. Was that how little he thought of me? He'd taken it as a foregone conclusion that Roach had killed me and Banjo. He didn't even seem to realize that someone like me could be capable of violence. Could he have come to that conclusion from our limited interactions while I was on Tate's farm? Could my failure to confront Tate about sexually harassing Aaron have solidified the notion that I was not someone to be feared or even worried about? I was sure this man, Conley, had been there at the drug deal. For all I knew, he was the one who'd shot Marcus, maybe even the one who'd nicked me. My arm seemed to spasm with the remembered sensation of slamming that rock into Roach's face. A rush of something I'd never really felt before cleared out the heavy, sticky cobwebs of fear and replaced them with a righteous, seething anger. It was the feeling of power, of capability, of punishing those who did wrong. As Conley's fingers gripped the rubbery, hairy mask, my right arm shot up, seemingly of its own volition, aiming the combat knife at a vulnerable part of his body with an instinctual move, and one that paid off with the sensation of tearing flesh as the blade sunk into the left side of his neck, just under his jaw. Completing his movement, he tore the mask from my head as I yanked the blade out of his neck. He dropped the mask, both hands going up to the wound, now pouring blood from his body. We stared into each other's eyes for a moment. His eyes were wide with terror. Mine were narrow with determination. A realization that surprised me probably as much as Conley was surprised to find my face under the mask. With both hands doing little to staunch the flow of blood, Conley turned around and lurched toward the open garage door. I moved after him, gripping him by the shoulder and jamming the knife into his back as hard as I could. I pulled the knife out. He spasmed, stumbled, and fell to the floor with a yell that made my shoulders bunch up. I stepped over and slammed his face into the garage floor with my foot, muffling his outburst. He fought feebly against me for a few moments as blood continued to pump out of him. He went limp as I looked out the garage door toward the house, hoping no one had heard his yell. It seemed no one had. Looking back down, I noticed a pistol tucked into Conley's back waistband. I took it, shoving it into a hip pocket of the overalls. The bag I had heard Conley drop sat nearby. It was a military-style duffel and full to the brim. I opened the top to see that it was full of weed. Marcus's weed, no doubt. It seemed clear to me that Conley had come out here to take a four-wheeler so he could stash the weed somewhere safe on Tate's orders. That gave me an idea. I still had the knife in my hand, but I needed both hands free, and I didn't want to risk putting it back inside the overalls again. There was a single pocket on the chest part of the overalls, but it was too shallow to hold the knife. So I took a minute to cut through the bottom of the pocket with the knife, creating a makeshift sheath for the blade that held it snugly enough. I slung the pack onto my back and fired up a four-wheeler. Making sure I had my hood up, I backed the four-wheeler out and drove around the side, leaving the vehicle idling as I shut the garage door. Anyone who heard the four-wheeler would just assume it was Conley, or so I hoped. I got back onto the four-wheeler and drove it into the woods for a couple 100 yards, where I stopped it and killed the engine. Leaving the vehicle and the bag of weed there, I ventured back through the woods toward the house. There were lights on in almost all the windows of the house, which gave me a little more confidence. It would be harder for someone inside to see out with the lights on. I was still feeling the high that came along with taking a life, but not just any life. I'd killed 2 men, and both of them were murderers or accomplices. It was amazing how fast my pacifist tendencies had been left in the dirt. Or, more accurately, they'd been left on the floor of the garage, along with Conley's blood. I gripped the knife in my hand again as I moved up to a back window in a crouch. The cabin was built up off the ground, putting the bottom of the first-floor windows around chest height on me. Crouching below the window, I eased my head up and looked inside. The small dining area was unoccupied, and beyond it, I could see that there was no one in the kitchen either. The square dining table had some blood-stained money laid out on paper towels as the recently washed bills air-dried. I ducked down and moved to the next window at the back of the cabin, peering in to see Tate, and a man named Dawson sitting on a couch in the living room. They each had a beer in hand as they watched television. They were side on to me, but Tate turned his head toward the window. I ducked down, my confidence suddenly gone as my heart worked in overtime. I tried to listen beyond the blood rushing in my ears, even as I pulled the pistol out of my pocket. Crouching next to the window, I pointed the pistol up, waiting for Tate to stand up and look out, listening for him to say something to Dawson about a lurker outside. Seconds passed, nothing happened. The dull sounds of the television continued. No figure blocked the window. Nothing. I moved around to the other side of the house, bypassing what I knew was another living room window. I peered in through the side window, my pulse skyrocketing again as I saw Erin and Dawn in the room. Erin was lying curled on a mattress on the floor in the small bedroom. Her wrists and ankles were bound with rope and a gag was jammed into her mouth. Nearby, sitting on the other end of the mattress, was Dawn. Hope thundered in my chest as I saw that Dawn wasn't tied up. Without thinking it through, I shoved the gun back into my pocket and knocked gently on the window with my right hand. Dawn looked up as Erin lifted her head from the mattress. They both looked surprised to see me, but there was a noticeable difference in their expressions. A moment later, I realized my mistake. Erin screamed against her gag, shaking her head, making incomprehensible noises. A moment later, getting over her initial shock, Dawn shouted,
"Dustin's here! He's outside!"
My hope crashed down like a felled redwood as everything came together in my mind. Dawn was one of them. She had been around while Marcus discussed the deal. She had been there the whole time, gathering information, feeding it to Tate, setting up the ambush and the kidnapping. Thudding footsteps and shouting sounded from the direction of the living room as I backed away from the window, my eyes glued to a terrified Erin. The door to the bedroom slammed open, and Dawson stepped inside with a semi-auto rifle in his hands. I grasped for the pistol in my pocket, only realizing as I touched it that I hadn't learned how to use it, just like I hadn't checked the rifle. I didn't know where the safety was or if there was a bullet in the chamber. Ripping my eyes away from Erin as Dawson slipped his finger into the rifle's trigger guard, I tried to run. A moment later, gunshots erupted from behind me, in concert with the shattering of glass and a breathtaking pain in my back. Collapsing behind a tree some 30 yards from the house, I dropped the knife in my left hand and reached around my right side to feel my back. My fingers searched, touching a wound in the area just a few inches under my right armpit. I yanked my hand away from the pain and inspected my fingers, which were bloody. Breathing hurt, and I had the thought that I'd been shot in the lung.
Where is he?
Tate called. He wasn't far.
He ran that way.
Dawson answered. It sounded like they were both out of the house now, although Dawson sounded closer.
I think I hit him. Well, go find him. What about you?
Dawson asked.
I'll bring up the rear. Was he armed? All I saw was a knife.
Tate laughed.
A fucking knife? What an idiot.
I looked down at the combat knife and then dug the pistol out of my pocket. The two men fell silent, but I could hear their footsteps closing in. I studied the pistol, trying not to breathe so much, expecting my lungs to start filling with blood any moment. What little I knew about guns I'd gleaned from movies and TV shows. In those, guys always pulled back on the tops of these types of guns to put a bullet in the chamber. After wiping the blood from my left hand, I gripped the top of the pistol and pulled back. A bullet popped out of the side and rolled to the ground. Shit! But I guessed that meant it was loaded, and had been loaded before. The footsteps grew closer. They were maybe 10 yards away now. The trigger was self-evident enough, but what about a safety? There was a little button on the handle. The grip, I thought they called it. I pressed it, and the bottom fell out. Panic settling in, I put the clip back in. It clicked into place loudly.
You hear that?
Dawson said. He was very close.
Yeah.
Tate said from further away. Suddenly, the footsteps grew louder as Dawson and Tate rushed toward me. I shoved off from the tree, wincing as I got clumsily to my knees and spun around. There was only one more possibility on the pistol. One button near the trigger guard. I pressed it and threw myself to the left with the pistol out in front of me, held with both hands. I landed on my left side and took aim. Dawson was 5 yards away. Tate was 5 yards behind him and slightly to my left. Both men had their weapons up, but my dive from behind the tree had startled them. I pulled the trigger frantically, firing at the nearer threat who was Dawson. The gun kicked more than I expected. The first several bullets went wide as Dawson changed direction, trying to get cover. I was vaguely aware of Tate running for cover as well. I shifted and kept firing, and was soon rewarded as Dawson's left leg buckled. He cried out and fell to the ground. I shifted again, firing. A bullet hit him in the back, and then another in the head, taking a chunk out of his skull, but I kept firing. The gun clicked empty. I looked at it, wondering how it could possibly be empty. In the movies, guys seem to fire for minutes at a time without ever running out of bullets. Of course, this was a ridiculous notion. This wasn't the movies. This was as real as it got, and Tate was still out there, although I couldn't see him. I scrambled up and grabbed the combat knife from the ground, then I ran. Tate fired, and bullets crashed into trees next to me. I came to a divot in the land and threw myself into it, biting the inside of my cheek against the pain that erupted in my ribs, but the gunfire stopped, and I had a chance to catch my breath. I still held the empty pistol in one hand and the knife in the other. Tossing the pistol aside, I knew I had to finish this quickly before Glenn and Irvin got back from Marcus's house. If they came back soon, I was as good as dead.
You're out of bullets, aren't you?
Tate yelled through the forest. He was a good distance away, which gave me some small amount of hope.
I found your gun, Dustin. Better give up now. Otherwise, I'm going to do some awful stuff to your girlfriend. If you come out now, I'll go easy on her. How's that for a fair fucking trade?
I didn't answer. I kept moving through the trees, back toward where I left the four-wheeler. I had managed to crawl along the divot I'd used for cover until I came to a group of bushes that blocked me from view. At which point, I ran, stopping here and there behind trees to make sure Tate hadn't seen me. I kept my left hand clamped to my ribs so I could avoid leaving a trail of blood. Most of it was getting soaked up by my clothes anyway, but I still didn't want to bleed out. Sprinting the last 20 yards to the ATV sent bolts of pain through my ribs. I shoved the knife down into the makeshift sheath again and picked up the rucksack full of weed. I then jumped onto the ATV. With a large bag of weed lying across my thighs, I fired at the vehicle and tore off into the forest. Gunshots sounded behind me, prompting me to duck my head as bullets buzzed around. When I'd gone over a ridge in the land that would keep me hidden from Tate momentarily, I aimed the ATV at a large tree, thumbing the throttle, speeding toward the stately redwood. Steeling myself, I took my left hand off the handlebar and grabbed the bag of weed, standing up from the seat. The tree was growing large in my vision, but I had to time this right. I tensed my legs, gripped the bag, and kept the vehicle aimed straight at the tree with one hand. When I was a few yards away, I threw myself off the ATV, using the bag of weed as a cushion as I hit the ground. The ATV smashed into the tree. I rolled painfully to a stop and looked at it. There wasn't much time left. I stood up, took the knife out of the front pocket, and then started taking off the overalls. From where I crouched behind a fallen tree, I could see the bag of weed I'd dressed in Roach's clothes clearly. I had pulled the overalls up over one end of the bag and the large hoodie I'd been wearing underneath over the other end. Then I'd laid the thing across the handlebars to make it look like I had hit the tree head-on and was injured. From the side, where I was, it didn't actually look like a person. It looked like what it was, a hastily constructed dummy. But from the back, where I hoped Tate would come from, it would pass until he got to within 10 yards or so. By then, it would be too late for him. That was my hope, anyway. Now only wearing my own clothes, I stayed behind the fallen tree, gripping the combat knife, watching. It didn't take long for Tate to show up. He came running over the contour in the land, stopping behind a tree and glancing toward the crashed ATV. I watched from my hiding spot as he pointed the rifle toward the dummy. But he didn't fire. Instead, he moved forward, running to another tree. I got ready to move. When he rushed to another tree, I moved as well, running to the first tree he had stopped at. I was trusting that the sound of his movements would cover the sound of mine. I stayed behind the tree, not daring to poke out, until I heard him move again, at which point I moved too, only stopping when he stopped. He was getting close enough to see through my ruse, so I had to make a move. We moved once more. This time, I peered around the tree toward Tate, who now raised the rifle, took aim, and fired at the dummy. While the sound of the gunshot reverberated through the woods, I bolted from behind the tree, racing towards him as fast as I could with the knife in my hand, blade pointed down so I could stab him with it. Righteous anger fueled my muscles as I closed on the man. The remembered feeling of smashing Roach's skull with the rock seemed to raise me up, making me taller, stronger, and faster. I recalled the way Conley's flesh felt as it gave way under the point of the knife, and how bits of Dawson's head had blown away as a bullet struck him. But the thing that lodged in that deep and ancient part of my brain was the violation Tate had perpetrated when he groped Aaron. That, more than anything, gave me some joy at the prospect of killing this man. It made me hate him with the most basic and fundamental part of my unthinking brain. I raised the knife. Tate heard me, spinning around, working through his surprise as he tried to get his rifle pointed at me. Launching through the air, I released a sound I'd never made in my life. It was a banshee howl like the one I heard at the drug deal as the shooting started. It was at once a very human sound, but also unmistakably animalistic. I went for the face, jamming the knife down, the blade hitting just below his left eyebrow and sliding down to sink through his left eye. The blade sunk in, driven by my hate and muscle and momentum, until the width of the knife stuck in his eye socket and could go in no further. Tate stumbled away, releasing pained sounds. I let him go, yanking the knife out of his eye and jumping behind the tree just as he fired his gun wildly.
You bastard!
He screamed, while his gun clicked empty.
You fucking bastard!
I peered out, seeing that Tate had released the empty magazine and was pulling a new one out of a back pocket. Blood streamed down his face, and his ruined eye made him look like the monster I knew he was. Now was the time to finish this. I bolted around the tree and ran directly at him. He saw me with his good eye and turned to run, putting distance between us so we could get the new magazine into the rifle. But his depth perception was messed up, and he tripped on a root, sprawling on the ground. The magazine clattered out of reach. As I ran up to him, he spun around onto his back and tossed the rifle aside, raising his empty hands to show submission and surrender.
Wait!
He cried.
I give up!
I stopped next to him and snatched the rifle up, pointing the knife at him as though it were a gun.
Don't move! I'm done, man!
He said.
I'm done! Jesus Christ, you fucked me up! You took my eye!
I stood up, rifle in hand, looking down at him, but I said nothing. Looking over at the magazine nearby, I decided I would get it and hold him hostage. I would make him tell me about who else was left and where he put the money he'd stolen from Marcus. But in order to do that, I had to put the knife away. I slid the blade between my belt and my pants. As soon as I had it snugly put away, Tate lunged for me, going for the knife. Acting purely on reflex, I slammed the tip of the barrel into his face, hitting his ruined eye. He let out a screech and fell back. Now with both hands on the rifle, I hit him with the barrel again, smashing it into his nose. And then I did it again, hitting him in the other eye. He put his hands over his face, but I kept going, leading with the barrel, smacking it down like I was trying to drive a pole into the ground. His fingers snapped, his skin split, and soon enough, his mangled hands fell away. But I kept going. I worked until my hands were developing blisters, and the sound of each hit had turned from a crunching thud into a wet squelch. When I was done, I stared down at his mangled face and said something I never thought I would say in my life. It was something I had, up to that point, only associated with macho assholes. I said,
You shouldn't have messed with my girl.
When I got back to the house, I circled around to the now shattered window and looked through to see Erin still on the mattress, still tied up. She saw me, her eyes going wide as she tried to speak through the gag. I was about to ask her where Dawn had gone when I heard a vehicle approaching the house. I ran to the front of the property and hid behind an old truck with no tires and no seats. After killing Tate, I'd picked up the magazine he'd been trying to load. And on my walk back through the woods, I'd figured out how to work the thing. I'd even fired one shot to see if I had damaged the barrel badly while beating Tate with it. It seemed to shoot straight, as far as I could tell. Now, through the truck's grimy windows, I watched as Glenn and Irvin came back in the same vehicle they'd left in. I waited for them to get out of the truck before I popped up with the rifle.
Don't move,
I said. They both turned toward me, slightly surprised but by no means fearful.
What the fuck?
Irvin asked, reaching toward his back waistband.
I said don't fucking move!
They didn't listen. They were both moving and reaching. I aimed and fired. Being as close as I was, it wasn't a surprise that I hit them both on the first few shots. They fell to the ground, and I shot each of them several more times. They both died quickly. It was more than I could save for Tate. I figured I still had several rounds left in the gun, so I moved into the house, expecting Dawn to pop out at me with a gun at any moment. But I didn't find her anywhere in the house. Only after I had cleared the place did I go to the room with Erin in it. I knelt beside her and took the knife out to cut her binds.
Where'd Dawn go?
I asked when I got her gag off.
I think she left. I heard a car start outside soon after she ran out of the room.
I got her arms free and pulled her into a hug.
I'm so glad you're okay,
I said.
What happened?
She asked.
Where's Tate and the rest of them? I killed them,
I said, unable to quell the hint of pride in my voice. She pulled away from me and looked me in the eye.
All of them? Yeah,
I said.
all of them. They're all dead.
She studied my face, brow furrowing as if to say, "You?" But she didn't. She just hugged me again. We stayed that way for a long while, just holding each other. When we released and I cut the binds around her ankles, I caught her looking at me strangely. I'd never seen that look in her eyes before. It took me a while to realize what it was, but I finally figured it out. Because that look hasn't gone away. Not in the months since we left Humboldt, using the money we took from Tate's house to buy a van and travel the country, just like we'd planned. I know that Erin looks at me with a certain amount of fear now. She never in a million years thought I would be capable of such violence. But I can't blame her for that, because neither did I. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.